From the outside, James Lockhart's life was the kind people envied. As the CEO of an influential tech conglomerate, his name was synonymous with innovation and power. His skyscraper office towered over the city, a symbol of his unyielding dominance in the corporate world. At home, his equally successful wife, Vanessa, painted a picture-perfect image of their marriage. She was a celebrated artist, known for her abstract works that hung in galleries across the globe. Together, they were the epitome of a power couple, blending ambition and sophistication seamlessly. But James wasn't one to be blinded by appearances, even his own. His success was built on an analytical mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. Lately, those patterns had begun to shift. Vanessa's behavior had become erratic, subtle but undeniable. It started with her sudden weekend absences, under the pretext of finding inspiration for her next series. "I need the quiet," she would say, packing her brushes and canvases into the back of their luxury SUV. "The city stifles me." James wanted to believe her. Art had always been Vanessa's refuge, her way of expressing the complexities she couldn't articulate. But her inspiration trips to the lake had become more frequent, almost ritualistic. Every Saturday morning, she would leave before sunrise and return late on Sunday night, smelling faintly of lavender and lake water. She claimed to be working tirelessly on a new collection for winning the award for creative life's work. James had yet to see a single finished piece. It wasn't just her absences, there were other things. Her sudden tendency to guard her phone, the quiet smirk she wore when she thought he wasn't looking, and the vague explanations she gave about her plans. Then there were the silences, the kind that stretched longer than usual over dinner, filled with an unspoken tension James couldn't quite place. He told himself it was the stress of their demanding lives, but a gnawing doubt had begun to take root in his mind. That Saturday morning, as Vanessa kissed him goodbye, her smile felt rehearsed. "Don't wait up," she said, brushing a hand through his hair. "You know how lost I get in my work." By noon, James was driving out to the lake. He hadn't told Vanessa he would be following her. There was no need to tip his hand. The drive was long, winding through quiet countryside roads that felt like a world away from the urban jungle he dominated. The lake was a serene, sprawling expanse, surrounded by dense forest. It was a place that could easily inspire an artist or conceal a secret. He parked his car in a secluded spot and approached the shoreline on foot. The lake was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. His heart thudded as he scanned the horizon. For a moment, he thought Vanessa wasn't there. Then he saw it, a small rowboat drifting lazily in the middle of the lake. Inside sat two figures. James's chest tightened as he focused on the scene. Even from a distance, he recognized Vanessa's flowing auburn hair. She was laughing, her head tilted back in a way that made her look carefree and radiant. Beside her, a man leaned in, his hand brushing hers as he said something James couldn't hear. The intimacy between them was unmistakable, a sharp contrast to the growing distance in his own marriage. He stayed hidden among the trees, his jaw clenched as he watched the tableau unfold. Vanessa, his wife of 15 years, the woman he had built his empire alongside, was here, betraying him with another man. And not just any man. James squinted, trying to make out the stranger's face. It wasn't clear yet, but something about his silhouette felt eerily familiar. As the boat glided gently across the water, Vanessa reached out, touching the man's cheek with a tenderness that sent a wave of anger coursing through James. She thought she was safe out here, miles away from the city and prying eyes. But she hadn't counted on James's instincts or his determination to uncover the truth. He turned and walked back to his car, his mind racing. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. He could feel it. The pieces didn't add up yet, but his instincts told him this was deeper, more insidious. Vanessa wasn't just stepping out on their marriage. She was hiding something much bigger. James would find out what it was, and when he did, the consequences would be devastating. For now, he would wait. Betrayal was a game and James was a master strategist. If Vanessa thought her secret was safe, she was gravely mistaken. James drove back to the city in silence, the sound of the engine fading into the roar of thoughts in his head. He replayed the scene by the lake, dissecting every detail. The way Vanessa laughed, as if the weight of their life together didn't exist. The stranger's proximity, the easy intimacy between them. Betrayal was an unfamiliar wound, sharp and festering. But James wasn't a man who let emotions cloud his judgment. He'd built his empire on logic and control, and now he would wield those same tools to expose the truth. The first step was understanding his adversaries. Betrayal rarely existed in isolation. It thrived in networks, among hidden allies and shared secrets. James didn't just want to catch Vanessa in the act. He needed to uncover the full extent of her deceit. Was this affair purely personal, or did it intersect with his professional world? He had learned long ago that trust, once broken, often left a wider trail of damage than anticipated. Back at his penthouse, James stepped into his study, a sleek, minimalist space overlooking the glittering city. He sat down at his desk, logging into the security systems he'd installed years ago. He wasn't a paranoid man, but he believed in preparation. The cameras in their home, subtle and discreet, weren't just for protection. They were for moments like this. Pulling up the footage from the past month, James scanned for anomalies. Vanessa's comings and goings had been predictable. Her weekend trips, late nights at her studio, gallery events. But as he watched her in fast forward, a pattern emerged. Every Friday evening she received a phone call. She would disappear into the study, speaking in hushed tones, her expression shifting between tension and a peculiar kind of anticipation. The calls always lasted exactly 7 minutes. On a hunch, James accessed the call logs from their shared phone plan. The number was unlisted, anonymous. He forwarded it to a private investigator he had worked with in the past, a quiet, efficient man named Grayson, who specialized in uncovering what people thought was buried. Within an hour, Grayson called back. "The number's a burner," Grayson said, his voice gravelly. "Hard to trace, but not impossible. I'll need more time." "Take it," James replied curtly, "and dig deeper. I want to know who's behind this." While Grayson worked, James turned his attention to Vanessa's art studio. It was located in the trendy district downtown, a loft space filled with canvases and jars of paint. It was her sanctuary, and James had always respected that. Until now. He drove there that evening, his mind calculating the probabilities of what he might find. The studio was unlocked, as always. Vanessa trusted the neighborhood, and James suspected she had nothing to hide here. But trust, as he'd learned, was often misplaced. The air smelled of turpentine and lavender, her signature scent. Canvases leaned against the walls, their surfaces raw and incomplete, streaked with bursts of color. For a moment, James felt a pang of guilt. This was her world, separate from his. But then he spotted it. A small, leather-bound notebook on her work table, partially hidden beneath a pile of sketches. James opened it carefully, flipping through pages of scrawled notes and sketches. At first it seemed innocuous. Color palettes, inspirations, fragments of poetry. But then he reached the last few pages, and his stomach clenched. There were dates, locations, and cryptic phrases. Rowboat, quiet waters, lavender dusk. Beneath one entry was a name, Edward. It was circled, underlined, and accompanied by a rough sketch of a man's face. Sharp jawline, tousled hair, a crooked smile. The familiarity of the features struck James like a blow. He couldn't place it immediately, but he knew he had seen that face before. He snapped a photo of the page and left the studio, his mind racing. The name was a starting point, but it wasn't enough. James needed leverage, something to confront Vanessa with when the time came. For now, he would bide his time, gather more evidence, and piece together the puzzle. The next morning, Grayson called again. "I've got something," he said. The burner phone is linked to an encrypted messaging app. And guess what? The account is registered under the name Edward Harrington. The name sent a shockwave through James. Edward Harrington was a name he knew well, not as a stranger, but as a former colleague. Years ago, Edward had been a rising star at James's company, a brilliant but reckless strategist. Their relationship had soured after Edward attempted to steal proprietary information to launch his own competing firm. James had crushed him, both professionally and legally, leaving Edward a disgraced and bitter man. Now it all made sense. Edward wasn't just sleeping with Vanessa, he was orchestrating something bigger. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about dismantling James's life piece by piece. "Find out everything you can about Edward," James ordered. "Where he's been, who he's working with. I want a full profile." Over the next week, Grayson delivered. Edward had resurfaced in the tech world, consulting for smaller firms, staying under the radar. But his real work wasn't in boardrooms. It was in manipulation. He had been quietly forging alliances with James' competitors, leaking sensitive information that had caused minor setbacks for the company. At first, James had dismissed those setbacks as market fluctuations, but now he saw Edward's fingerprints all over them. The personal and professional betrayals were intertwined, each feeding into the other. Vanessa wasn't just cheating. She was a pawn in Edward's vendetta, or worse, a willing accomplice. James's fury simmered, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he channeled it into action. He began laying his own traps, using his connections to quietly monitor Edward's movements and Vanessa's communications. He hired a forensic accountant to trace financial discrepancies, suspecting Edward might be funneling money through shell companies. The evidence piled up, a damning collection of facts and figures that painted a clear picture of their collusion. One evening, James sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. He held Vanessa's notebook in one hand and a printout of Edward's financial transactions in the other. The betrayal was deeper than he had imagined, but he wasn't broken. If anything, he felt sharper, more focused. This was a battle, and battles were won with strategy, not emotion. That night, Vanessa came home late, smelling of lavender and lake water as usual. She kissed James on the cheek, her smile radiant and false. "Long day," she said, dropping her bag on the couch. James studied her, his expression unreadable. "I bet," he said evenly. "You must be exhausted." Vanessa didn't notice the edge in his tone. She moved to pour herself a glass of wine, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. James watched her, his mind calculating his next move. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, not until he had all the pieces in place. But soon, the game would shift, and when it did, Vanessa and Edward would learn that James Lockhart was not a man to cross. James Lockhart wasn't just preparing for confrontation, he was constructing a masterpiece of strategy. Betrayal, he had realized, wasn't a singular act, it was a web, and its strands needed to be untangled carefully. Edward Harrington and Vanessa had tied their threads together, but James would pull them apart one by one. The first strand to pull was Edward. Over the next few days, Grayson's team dug deeper into Edward's operations. The man was cunning, but his arrogance left cracks in his armor. James learned that Edward was using his influence to court several of James's closest business allies, spreading whispers of James's alleged instability and hinting at a lucrative opportunity to join a rival venture. Edward's fingerprints were subtle, but Grayson's team traced them back to Edward's newest endeavor, a tech startup that was aggressively seeking funding from James's competitors. This wasn't just about professional revenge. Edward wanted to ruin James's reputation and siphon away his most valuable assets, his network, his investors, and ultimately, his empire. James smiled coldly as he read the reports. Edward's game was ambitious but reckless. He didn't realize that James had been quietly countering his moves, meeting with key allies and reinforcing their loyalty. Over expensive dinners and discreet meetings, James laid out Edward's history of duplicity, framing him as a desperate man grasping for relevance. Most were quick to reaffirm their allegiance to James, though a few had to be convinced with offers of new partnerships and shares in future ventures. By the end of the week, James had effectively cut off Edward's access to funding from anyone who mattered. But James wasn't content with just isolating Edward professionally. He needed to strike deeper. At home, Vanessa continued her routine, blissfully unaware that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. James observed her closely, noting every slip in her behavior. She was careful, yes, but not as clever as she believed. One evening, while Vanessa was in the shower, James accessed her phone using a cloned backup he'd prepared. The encrypted messaging app was filled with conversations between her and Edward. Their exchanges were a toxic blend of affection and scheming, with Edward feeding her fantasies about leaving James and starting a new life together. But there was more. Hidden between the personal messages were discussions of confidential business deals, ones James recognized as proprietary to his company. Vanessa had been feeding Edward insider information. She wasn't just a participant in Edward's revenge, she was an accomplice. James' hand tightened around the phone. The betrayal stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. Vanessa had been his partner, his equal, or so he had believed. That she could sell him out so completely felt like a deeper wound than even the affair. But James didn't allow the pain to linger. Pain, he knew, was a distraction. He filed the information away, preparing for the right moment to use it. The second strand to pull was his company. Edward had been planting seeds of distrust among James' executives, and James needed to ensure that his internal circle was untouchable. He called an emergency board meeting, presenting his findings with a calm precision that belied the storm brewing inside him. "I've been made aware of attempts to undermine our operations," James began, his voice steady. "These attempts are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger scheme orchestrated by Edward Harrington." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but James pressed on, laying out the evidence, the financial records, the intercepted communications, and even Edward's failed overtures to their investors. "He's trying to destabilize us from within," James continued. "But I've already taken steps to neutralize his influence. What I need from all of you is your vigilance and loyalty." James' presentation was masterful, balancing transparency with authority. By the time he finished, the board members were fully aligned, their concerns assuaged by James's proactive approach. They left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to protect the company from Edward's schemes. The third strand to pull was Vanessa herself. James wasn't ready to confront her directly, but he needed to understand her motivations. Was she manipulated by Edward, or was her betrayal born of her own ambitions? He decided to approach her subtly, testing her resolve. One evening, over dinner, James brought up the topic of trust. "You know," he said, swirling his wine glass, "I've been thinking a lot about loyalty lately. It's such a rare quality in our world." Vanessa looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "Loyalty? Why the sudden interest?" James shrugged. "I suppose it's because I've seen so many betrayals in business. People I thought I could trust turned out to have their own agendas." Vanessa's fork hovered in the air for a moment before she resumed eating. "That's the nature of the corporate world, isn't it? Everyone's looking out for themselves." "True," James agreed, watching her closely. "But I like to believe that personal relationships are different. Don't you?" Her smile was faint, almost forced. "Of course, James. Personal relationships are built on trust." The conversation left James more convinced than ever that Vanessa was hiding something. Her evasiveness spoke volumes, but it also fueled his resolve. If she wanted to play games, he would let her. For now. James' next move was a calculated risk. He decided to draw Edward out of hiding, forcing him to act recklessly. Using one of his trusted allies, James leaked false information about a major acquisition his company was planning. The deal was entirely fabricated, designed to look like a lucrative opportunity that would attract Edward's attention. The bait worked. Within days, Edward began making moves to sabotage the deal, spreading rumors among potential investors and attempting to poach key personnel involved in the acquisition. James watched from the sidelines, documenting every step Edward took. The trap was closing, and Edward didn't even realize it. At the same time, James began to tighten his grip on Vanessa. He started leaving subtle clues that he knew more than he was letting on. A misplaced phone, a half-read message on her tablet, a cryptic comment about trust. Vanessa grew visibly uneasy, her composure cracking under the pressure. James took note of every slip, every moment of doubt. The climax of his strategy came one evening when Vanessa returned from another weekend retreat. This time, James was waiting for her in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand. "You're late," he said casually, his eyes fixed on hers. Vanessa hesitated, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "I told you not to wait up." "I wasn't waiting," James replied, his tone smooth but firm. "I've just been thinking about us, about honesty." Her face paled, but she forced a smile. "What's this about, James?" He leaned back, studying her. "I think it's time we had a real conversation, Vanessa, about the choices we make and the consequences." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them both. Vanessa's facade was cracking, and James could see the fear in her eyes. But he wasn't ready to deliver the final blow. Not yet. First, he needed her to admit to the betrayal. Only then could he decide what justice would look like. James Lockhart had spent his life dismantling opponents, one calculated move at a time. Vanessa and Edward were no different. Their betrayal had set the stage for a reckoning, and James was determined to see it through. James Lockhart had spent weeks building his strategy, each step calculated, each move deliberate. The web of betrayal spun by Vanessa and Edward was intricate, but James had unraveled it with precision. Now, the time had come to act. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over his life. It can be a freeing thing. The first strike was aimed at Edward. James had no intention of confronting him directly. He preferred to dismantle his enemy from a distance. Using the fabricated acquisition deal as bait, James had lured Edward into a trap. Now, with Grayson's help, he executed the final phase. Through a series of discreet meetings, James had gathered evidence of Edward's attempts to sabotage the acquisition. Emails, phone records, and financial transactions painted a damning picture of Edward's illegal activities. James ensured this evidence landed in the hands of the authorities, along with an anonymous tip about Edward's involvement in corporate espionage. The fallout was swift. Within days, Edward's fledgling startup was raided by investigators. News outlets picked up the story, painting Edward as a disgraced former executive who had stooped to criminal activities to claw his way back to relevance. Investors fled, and Edward's carefully constructed house of cards collapsed. James watched the drama unfold from his office, his expression unreadable. He felt no triumph, only a cold satisfaction. Edward had underestimated him, and now he was paying the price. Vanessa, however, was a more complex adversary. Her betrayal was not just professional, it was deeply personal. James couldn't simply destroy her as he had Edward. He needed something more nuanced, something that would force her to confront the depth of her deception. One evening, James invited Vanessa to dinner at their favorite restaurant, a luxurious rooftop venue overlooking the city. She arrived dressed impeccably, her smile radiant but tinged with unease. She had sensed his growing distance, his quiet intensity, but she hadn't yet pieced together the extent of his knowledge. Throughout dinner, James played the role of the attentive husband, asking about her art, her latest inspirations, and her weekend trips to the lake. Vanessa seemed to relax, her guard lowering as the wine flowed. But James was watching her closely, noting every flicker of hesitation, every calculated answer. When dessert arrived, James leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine. "Vanessa," he said, his tone casual, "do you ever think about how fragile trust is, how easily it can be broken?" Her hand froze mid-reach for her glass. "What do you mean?" James held her gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I mean, It's remarkable how someone can spend years building a foundation of trust only to see it crumble because of a single betrayal. Vanessa's smile faltered. "James, what's this about?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's about Edward Harrington and the lies you've been telling me." The color drained from Vanessa's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. James placed a hand on the table, his voice calm but deadly serious. "I know everything, Vanessa. The weekends at the lake, the messages, the business information you've been feeding him. I know about his plans to sabotage me, and I know you were helping him." Vanessa's eyes filled with panic. "James, it's not what you think." "Don't," James interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't insult me by lying again. I have the evidence. I've seen the messages. I've watched you betray me, not just as a husband, but as a partner." Tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes, but James felt no pity. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. Back at their penthouse, James laid out the terms of their reckoning. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting his legal team to ensure every detail was airtight. "You have two options," James said, his tone cold and measured. "Option 1. I go public with everything, your affair with Edward, your role in his schemes, the insider information you leaked. The art world will turn its back on you, and you'll lose everything, your reputation, your career, your credibility." Vanessa stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Option 2, James continued, you walk away quietly. I'll file for divorce, and you'll receive a settlement, not a generous one, but enough to start over. In return, you will sever all ties with Edward and agree to a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. You will not speak about me, our marriage, or my business. Ever." Vanessa's voice was barely a whisper. "James, please, I made a mistake, but I didn't mean for it to go this far." James' expression hardened. "A mistake? No, Vanessa, a mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something you didn't mean. What you did was calculated. You betrayed me, and you betrayed everything we've built together." Vanessa broke down, sobbing into her hands, but James felt no sympathy. He had given her everything, his trust, his loyalty, his love, and she had thrown it away. The next day, Vanessa chose the second option. She packed her belongings and left the penthouse, her departure quiet and unceremonious. James watched her go with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Their marriage had been a lie, but it was still painful to see it end this way. In the weeks that followed, James focused on rebuilding. The fallout from Edward's schemes had been contained, and the company emerged stronger than ever. James used the ordeal as a lesson, tightening his security measures and reinforcing his inner circle. He became more guarded, more vigilant, but also more determined. Vanessa's departure became a footnote in his life, a chapter he closed with finality. She attempted to reach out once, sending a letter filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. James read it once, then burned it. He had no interest in reopening old wounds. Months later, James stood in his office, gazing out at the city. The betrayal had scarred him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had sharpened his resolve. He had learned that even the closest relationships could harbor deception. But he had also learned the value of resilience. As he turned back to his desk, his phone buzzed with a message from Grayson. It was a brief update. Edward Harrington had fled the country, his reputation and finances in ruins. Vanessa, meanwhile, had moved to a small coastal town, living a quiet, unremarkable life. The reckoning was over, but the lessons it had taught him would remain forever. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. James Lockhart had endured a betrayal that cut deeper than any business loss or corporate setback. It wasn't just about losing Vanessa or facing Edward's schemes. It was about the quiet dismantling of the trust he'd built his life around. In the months following the reckoning, James found himself reevaluating everything: his priorities, his relationships, and even the definition of success. Yet even as the company flourished, James felt a hollowness he couldn't quite shake, The betrayal had left him questioning not just Vanessa's loyalty, but also his own ability to trust. He had spent years surrounding himself with people he believed were loyal, colleagues, friends, even family. But loyalty, he now realized, was a fragile thing, easily fractured by ambition, resentment, or the allure of something new. One evening, James stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the city skyline. The view had always inspired him, reminding him of what he had built and the power he wielded. But tonight, it felt different. The lights seemed distant, the towering buildings cold and unfeeling. He realized he had been living in a fortress of his own making. Impressive, yes, but isolating. His mind wandered to Vanessa. She was gone from his life now, living quietly in the coastal town where she had retreated. He had heard nothing from her since the letter he burned, and he preferred it that way. Still, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if she regretted her choices. Did she miss the life they had built? Or was she content with the freedom her betrayal had bought her? James shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. Regret was a useless emotion. Vanessa had made her decisions, and so had he. There was no going back. In his solitude, James began to explore parts of himself he had long neglected. He started taking long walks in the park, something he hadn't done in years. The simple act of being among people, families, couples, children playing, was strangely grounding. He found himself struck by the ordinary beauty of life, the small moments of joy and connection that he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench watching the world go by, an elderly man struck up a conversation with him. The man, dressed in a weathered coat and hat, spoke with the ease of someone who had seen it all. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind," the old man said, his voice warm but probing. James smiled faintly. "You could say that." The man chuckled. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? But you learn to catch them or let them pass." James found himself opening up, sharing a vague outline of his recent experiences. The old man listened without judgment, offering occasional nods and knowing smiles. "Betrayal's a tough one," the man said finally. "Cuts deep, especially when it comes from someone you trusted. But here's the thing. You can let it harden you, or you can let it teach you. The choice is yours." James considered the words long after the man left. He had always prided himself on his ability to learn from failure, to adapt and grow. This, he realized, was no different. Betrayal had taught him painful lessons, but it had also given him a chance to reevaluate his life. Over time, James began to rebuild not just his company, but himself. He reached out to old friends he had lost touch with, mending relationships that had frayed over the years. He invested in his employees, creating programs to support their growth and well-being. He even began mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing not just his successes, but also the mistakes and missteps that had shaped him. James also learned to let go of his need for absolute control. He had always believed that his analytical mind and meticulous planning were his greatest strengths, but the betrayal had shown him the limits of his control. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often unfair. Accepting that truth rather than fighting against it brought him a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. Months turned into a year, and James found himself at a new crossroads. His company was stronger than ever, his personal life more balanced. Yet, there was still a part of him that felt unfinished, as though a chapter of his life remained unresolved. One evening, as he sat in his study, a package arrived. It was from Grayson, who had continued monitoring Edward's activities even after his downfall. Inside was a brief report. Edward, desperate and penniless, had resurfaced in a small European city, working odd jobs to survive. There was no threat left in him, no chance of resurgence. He was a man defeated. James stared at the report for a long moment before setting it aside. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Edward's fate was a consequence of his own choices, just as James's recovery had been his. There was no need to dwell on it further. As James closed the file, He felt a strange sense of closure. The betrayal that had once consumed him was now a distant memory, a scar that no longer hurt. He wasn't the same man he had been before. He was stronger, wiser, and, perhaps more importantly, more human. Standing on the balcony that night, James looked out at the city again. The lights no longer felt distant. They felt alive, vibrant, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile, a genuine, unguarded smile. Betrayal had tested him in ways he never expected, but it had also shaped him into a better version of himself. And as he stood there, gazing at the horizon, James knew that the future was his to write.